Hello? 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 Hello?
No. You guys, my name. You
It's his fault. Cheers,
Oh, that is it.
Oh, it's here.
You actually have a better. Why do you do this to me? Your head is rather large. No. Are you sure?
May I now call this house to order? Okay. Welcome to Welcome to the 2014 APU Debate Open Finals. Can we have a round of applause for our finalists? On government side, we have NTUnicorn, Aditya, Huiyi, and Viha. On opposition, we have MUTO, consisting of Tim, Marvin, and Kanna. Paneling with me will be Ali, Arina, Spencer, and Ashwarya. And of course, the esteemed timekeeper, Huiyi. Yeah, okay. So on the motion, this House believes that self-identified humanitarians have a moral obligation to reject voluntourism, and I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to start off this debate.
Ah, it's my face. Yep. Good sharing, right? Congrats. Mr. Speaker, when you see empty school buildings in certain cities in Kenya where there are no students to study in those schools, and yet you see cities in the same country with no schools at all, then you know you have a problem. We think it's morally repugnant for you to turn poor people into objects that feed your vanity and self-esteem while harming them in the process, when you could have done a far better job and given them much more with the same amount of money and effort. This debate is a value judgment debate on whether volunteerism in its current state is bad and whether alternatives are preferable, and what humanitarians should reject and what they should promote. We're not saying that volunteerism doesn't do any good at all, but we're saying with the same money and the effort, a far better good can be done to millions of people across the world, and we think it's wasteful. Mr. Speaker, I have 4 arguments today. Firstly, when do we have an obligation to reject something? We think when something fundamentally does more harm than good to your intended cause and does more harm to the lives of the people or the individuals you want to help in the long run, we think you must reject it. Who are the humanitarians that we talk about? In this debate, humanitarians are usually things like public figures, people like owners of charities or rich personalities who often shape the narrative and around humanitarian actions. Things like celebrities often promote things like certain charities or certain actions which may then promote the narrative around what people do. Or anyone who self-identifies himself as a person who cares about other individuals and is willing to spend time and money to save or do better for other individuals. Having established what a volunteerist actually is, what are the harms of volunteerism? And there are multiple harms I'm going to talk to you about. Firstly, volunteerism is economically wasteful. Often volunteerism costs a lot of money to conduct. The fact that people from Western liberal democracies spend thousands of dollars to buy plane tickets and visa costs, as well as pay middlemen and travel agencies who charge them exorbitant prices to send them to countries, means that it's extremely economically wasteful to actually carry out these things. This money is far better utilized if it's gone to things like directly to charities who can do a far better allocation of those resources. Secondly, it strips jobs from locals, and this is extremely important. The kind of jobs you usually do as a volunteerist is extremely menial. Things like painting, things like decoration, things like building wells and houses in small cities. Volunteerism is not sending technocrats to certain places to give skills transfer. It is not setting up schools in villages in Kanna, Mr. Speaker. It is normal college dropouts. It's professionals who are bored with their lives and want to do something. It's rich blonde women who want to find their way in life and want to spend their money. It's significantly different from things like skills transfer or the kind of things the Red Cross or CRY do in countries around the world. You strip jobs from locals, the kind of jobs that could easily have been done by locals to give them a livelihood with minimal education. It's wasteful for you and it's wasteful for them. It's wasteful for them because it's a lost job, but it's wasteful for you because as a person from Western liberal democracies and a person of your level of education, at the same time you could have done something much better for that charity and use the skills that you actually have while maximizing the time that you spend with these charities in the first place. That's why it's economically wasteful for you, and obviously economically wasteful for people whose jobs you take in these countries. What are the, okay, yeah, go.
Absent the ability for me to find some form of esteem in the actions I do, what's the guarantee that I would continue to contribute to charity if there's nothing in it for me at all?
Right. Okay, we obviously assume that these individuals are people who are both willing to contribute money as well as their time to do good for the world. We don't think that most people who have the money to spend and want to do good obviously want to do it themselves. Even if they do, they can work for things like professional charities in professional capacities. They can donate this money to organizations who do these things on a regular basis and have far better expertise to do these things. So it's obviously quite intuitive to assume that these people would continue to do so and spend their money otherwise. In what kind of places is volunteerism actually concentrated, right? And I have 3 points under this. The first, these places are usually picked by these travel agencies or organizers in the most convenient of places which most closely replicate the facilities that you might find in Western liberal democracies. That's why volunteerism is often concentrated in cities and towns near cities, because it's far easier for Westerners to acclimatize and not have a massive change in their livelihoods when they come to these places. That's what makes it more attractive for people on the fence to actually come to these places, and that's why these are usually concentrated in places which already have resources. That may not be bad in and of itself, but the fact that you take away those resources to places which need it more than these places which already have some basic levels of sustenance is a bad thing. But secondly, it often concentrates resource allocation to only fixed areas, right? Why? Because they're picked by travel agencies and they have an incentive to use economies of scale. It's far easier to use and reuse facilities that you set up in one certain area rather than having to pay that fixed cost again and again. So once you set up a small village next to a city where you can get volunteerists, you continue to use that specific location to reduce your costs and maximize your profit margin. That's why resource allocation and volunteerism becomes concentrated in certain areas, and that's why it's bad. But thirdly, these travel companies may not always pick based on the actual big picture of need but convenience. These places are often just places picked due to fortune and not based on things like research, not based on things like a big picture analysis of the country and the needs of that country, things that charities can do far better than these voluntarist organizations. Why are there other better ways to do this? Because we will argue that humanitarians don't just have to reject voluntarism, but promote better ways of spending this money to individuals, and so that this money goes to different places. The first contention on this point is that there is a zero-sum game with your ability to contribute both money and people and the time that you're willing to spend. Obviously, you have a limited amount of time and social capital or money that you want to spend in these things. We think voluntarism gives you a false satisfaction and that you often feel convinced that you've done and fulfilled your role to these individuals and makes you feel good about yourself. While that may be a good thing in and of itself, but the fact that you actually haven't done as much good as you probably could under other circumstances means that this feeling good is actually wasteful and could have been achieved in other places where you actually do some tangible change and not just satisfy yourself. But secondly, individuals who participate in voluntarism often also don't recognize the bigger picture, right? They often just go to places which are posted on Facebook by their friends or recommended or travel agencies where other individuals are seeming to go. So these people don't usually have the ability to conduct this research. What should we support on the side of the proposition? We think humanitarians should support people donated to things like charities which are credible. These charities have a far better ability because they have things like foots on the ground. They have dedicated research teams who do research on economic indicators around the country and know where it matters the most. Things like international organizations who know the big picture, Mr. Speaker, who know where the money is best used and best optimized for that purpose, who have the expertise of doing this and have the ability to implement this money and put it to its best cause. We think it's a problem when voluntarism often concentrates money in places like Kenya, in places like Botswana, while they never go to places like Chad or the Central African Republic, places which might seem to us as being parts of Africa and almost the same, but are significantly different in the living standards that these countries often have. We think voluntarism is economically wasteful and a terrible thing to do. I'm extremely proud to propose. Sorry.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'd now like to invite Leader of Opposition to start off oppositions.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, y'all can hear me right, so it's fine. If I could sum up side government's case, it would essentially be that these people could have done more. And because they couldn't have done more, whatever they've done, no matter to even the most marginal extent of making someone else's life better, doesn't count. We think that kind of a principle is unfair and doesn't justly reward and recognize people for the efforts they do in making other people's lives better, regardless of how marginal or how small the difference may be. It is regrettable that Aditya came up here and only talked about voluntarism in the most extreme and bad circumstances, when he talked about how it's really about vanity and they don't really achieve anything at all. For a reasonable debate to ensue, you have to assume that some amount of charity can still come out from voluntarism, and we are okay with conceding that it may not be a great deal as compared to what you could have done, but we think there is some level of significance that it can contribute to people's lives anyway. Like when schools allow for students to take gap years to travel to areas with humanitarian problems and allow them to perform charitable services, although they are compensated with the kinds of money to do so anyway. We say a lot of good can be done. Schools can be built and people's lives can be changed. That is a single monolithic reflection of how voluntarism works, and we reject that as the only real reflection of how it can be. The stance aside opposition is fairly simple. We believe that there isn't a dichotomy of having to choose between self-preservation and material gain and performing charitable acts to begin with. We think the barometer of altruism is one that is an unrealistic principle to hold true to judge charitable acts, and we're happy to defend that. Before I go to my arguments proper, a couple of rebuttals. The first thing he came up here and said was, the last thing he came up here and said was, you get a sore sense of satisfaction when you do these menial things, and then you feel like you've done your part, and when you really haven't. But the fundamental assumption he's making thinking is that everybody has a burden to actually commit charity anyway, which they don't. We don't foster that burden onto every single individual to be able to have or perform charitable acts. So we think any form of satisfaction you can get of changing people's lives, we think is meaningful in that regard. And that is something they need to consider. The second thing came up here and said, it's economically wasteful. You could be doing so much more and spending thousands of dollars anyway. At which point I POI'd and said, what if that is the only way I decided as a humanitarian to want to change someone's life, that I wanted to change someone's life? And he said, well, no, because if you're a humanitarian, you would want to do so anyway. But we think the fact that in status quo, these people want to engage in things that maybe indulge their vanity, maybe indulge their self-preservation, is an inclination that that's the best permutation of how they want to be able to perform charitable acts, absent which they wouldn't want to do so anyway. So what's the guarantee that they would go on to continue or have charitable acts? They've never come up here and told us. I'm going to go on to my arguments right now, where the rest of the substantive material will be dealt in there. One, why should charity, or why can charity not come to any cost at yourself? Because first, if you extrapolate the logic that the barometer of altruism should be how we determine whether or not your charity and your charitable acts are sincere and legitimate, we think at any circumstance people shouldn't benefit from the kinds of charity, or people shouldn't have any form of material gain, and it has to come as some form of self-preservation, because you can always do more to help someone else's life as long as you're not a hungry kid in Africa fighting for your life. One, this is an artificial sit-down. This is an artificial burden on individuals to forego privilege, self-preservation, and any form of benefit to their identities, whether it be material or be it emotional, to be considered for their actions. Which means that their model places a self-righteous high barrier of entry when it qualitatively discriminates the kinds of actions and intentions that these people have. We think that's problematic when you have that kinds of hierarchy of charity, when you say, oh, I am a real humanitarian, you, however, are not, Madam Chair, and we think that is problematic. Charity need not come at the cost of yourself or you benefiting something from it. We think that is perfectly legitimate, had to have a motivation. What's problem, and why do we say that? One, the outcome is still positive, which means it makes a difference in someone else's life through the actions that you end up committing anyway. Which means if you look at a hungry kid in the eye and ask him if he gives a shit about why he was given food to eat or why he was built a school, I don't think he'll really care, Madam Chair. What he cares is that he's getting some form of benefit out of it anyway. So we think it's better to have a higher number of people who aren't altruistic, charitable people than to have a lower number of people who are truly altruistic and truly charitable individuals anyway. We think the outcome is determinant. But the second thing we came up here and talk about is that having and setting that kind of a standard for individuals that they should maximize everything they can, which is the same argument why rich people should do a lot and pay a lot more than just $1. We think it's problematic. Why? Because it patronizes the suffering of individuals when you try and relate and empathize or relate to the kinds of suffering they do. You wear your sacrifice as a badge of honor, as look at me, I've actually done a lot to be able to convince and help people's lives out. We think that is just as bad in terms of making someone else's suffering as your spotlight as an individual of charity. That is something that's problematic. Before I move on to my last argument, yes, Mitra.
Given the fact that time and money are both limited, there's a binary choice between giving to charities and going on voluntourism. Where should smart humanitarians optimize this money and convince people to donate to optimize?
Again, that functions under the assumption that I would commit one form of charitable act or the other. We don't think that's always the case, and that also functions under the assumption that you can recognize actions only when it is fulfilled to the maximum amount. We don't think that's the case. The third argument is this: what kind of climate do we want to have in society? How do we best form traction in helping individuals? The problem with their end model is that it shifts the rhetoric of everyone can do a part to make someone else's life better, which means a single individual can donate $1 that will go a long way in helping someone else's life, to how you go about doing so. Because their model assumes that if you were to earn $1 million, the burden is upon you to do a lot more, to spend your time and money that much more wisely. What's the problem with that form of a rhetoric? We think it's problematic because it alienates individuals when you set classes of people, or you set standards of who is a true who's truly committing acts of charity and who isn't. Individuals don't want to buy into a climate where they feel that there's a moral obligation of making sure that every charitable act they commit has to be at the biggest, or has to come at the biggest benefit to hungry individuals or to people who are suffering from humanitarian benefit, that they have to proportionately measure how much they should do because given the circumstances or their wealth or their income to begin with. What people want to see is the fact that everyone can do a part, no matter how small, as long as you have many people being able to do it. Then these are individuals as to how you really enact change and you really enact meaning in individuals' lives to begin with. The counter to this is what they're trying to say, that everyone in making the decisions to make smart choices should do the most they can with what they have, should make sure that the time is spent wisely, and unfortunately that is simply not an appealing rhetoric to the wide audience of individuals who do not want to choose between the dichotomy of self-preservation and committing charitable acts. As a net outcome, we still think we do, and we end up doing more good for individuals than that side of the house does, whether or not that recognition is legitimate or not. Mr. Chair, sorry, Mr. Chair, we think it's important for us to realize in this debate that charity can or may not always come at a cost of self-sacrifice, or may not always come at the cost of the best way to go about doing so. We don't think it diminishes the recognition that it deserves. For all these reasons, we're incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. To continue the government's case, I'd like to invite Deputy Prime Minister.
In very simple terms, voluntarism is not as harmless or even as beneficial as they want to make it out to be. What really is voluntarism? Voluntarism tends to entail ideal scenes of poverty that you visit, and then you come home with this snapshot of you standing beside a school you just helped to paint, holding the hand of this white-eyed African child you only knew a week ago while pretending you're best of friends with. Then you go home and write this self-indulgent emotional Facebook note about how you have learned to appreciate your home. What is the problem with this? Basically, you have done nothing but to indulge in an illusion of personal growth and altruism. You'll be lucky even, right, if you actually manage to avoid doing any harm to the people you profess to help at all. That is the sort of harmful vanity that Kanna is so against, that is what we take a stance against. Before I begin my case proper, two rebuttals. Firstly, they came out and told us, right, that we are faulting people for not having done more, though they did a small amount of good to begin with. No. Mitra has shown you there are extremely definite harms to what voluntarism entails. You waste job vacancies for menial labor that could have been open to locals who really need employment. You divert important donated resources that could have been done towards greater good. Adding on to that, right, furthermore, these people come in for a short-term holiday. So there's no awareness, no research and development into what people really need. There's this example, right, in how people raise money, went on a voluntarism trip, bought computers and installed them in a village school. People came back a year later and found these computers were never used. Why? Because in all their so-called self-indulgent altruism, they never realized that there were no electricity generators to allow these computers to work. That is precisely what is happening. There is no structural help, right, to empower the poor to actually help themselves in the long run. Furthermore, right, we realize that anyway, we're not banning voluntarism. We're just saying that it is better that you do not do it, especially because you're humanitarians. Why do I say this? Because humanitarians are role models and therefore have to show how to create optimum use of resources to help people. We think that the extra duty to go above and beyond and do so. Let me elaborate a bit on that, but before that, I will take a point.
If you're unwilling to accept that these kinds of voluntarism can have even a small amount of benefit, this debate becomes a fact and no longer an argument. Bite the bullet and tell me why small amounts of good are considered illegitimate.
I don't deny, right, that maybe you paint a wall and it's really cool, like airlines painted walls. The problem is that you have spent huge amount of resources flying all the way to Uganda just to paint a wall. And this sort of things, right, could be done by many other people. You can use similar resources to donate. We don't think it's fair that as humanitarians who set an example for people as to what really constitutes right ways of helping, you do so and you show sort of ways of resources to be optimum. Moving back to the idea of humanitarian volunteers, right, already we have shown you as ordinary volunteers, it is bad enough an idea. But furthermore, as a humanitarian that people look up to, you don't show the true harms and wastage of voluntarism to people who are looking for options as to how to volunteer. Furthermore, you validate the capitalist attempts, right, by voluntarism industries to legitimize themselves as more than just a holiday package. He came out and said he doesn't want people to compare and say, I'm a better humanitarian than you. You know what? We do. In this case, we really do. Because we do not want poser humanitarians who come out and pretend to do good and emulate nothing more but vanity that may be the detriment detriment of people truly in need. Moving on, right? They came out and told us that, well, maybe there are some well-planned volunteerism packages. I'm going to do that right now. That clears his POI again. So even the most well-planned volunteerism packages, right, are still by tourist agencies. There are tourist industries first and foremost. In other words, they are devoted first and foremost to the amusement of the people traveling there for 2 weeks for their volunteering stint. And in any case, when there is a trade-off, right, the pleasure of the tourists will therefore always be allowed to override the need of the poor. And we realize the great harm of that is not just in practical harms, but because you prioritize the tourist's interest first, right, you objectify the poor as objects for amusement, for entertainment, for self-indulgence of the tourists. And why is that morally repugnant, right? What we realize is that poverty and suffering is not a spectacle. It is not an ego trip for you. It goes against all notions of altruism, kindness, or basic human compassion that sustains any real long-term act of sustained giving. Furthermore, by objectifying the poor as subjects for you to help and feel good about, we think that it doesn't do anything but make you feel good. So it's really an illusion of impact. No, thank you. Worst of all, it is extremely disrespectful. It's disrespectful of the real life, the real struggles, and the real personalities of poor people in need. We think this undermines any dignity that these people deserve as human beings to enjoy. Given I've proven all that, no thank you, sir, I'm going to move on to my case proper. I'm going to bring you a further harm of volunteerism that shows you why humanitarians must stay away from it. Basically, it's especially bad for dependents in need. For instance, people like children, people are disabled. Basically, we realize that often these volunteerism trips entail working with vulnerable parties. They are easy targets, right? It's really easy to say, I went overseas to help children and makes you feel really good, that's best volunteerism ever, that sort of thing. But I realize that it's counterproductive. That is in fact cruelly and selfishly hurtful to these people. Why do I say so? Because it's highly emotionally damaging to people they are trying to outlive. We're talking parties like, say, orphaned children, the disabled, people in shelters from being abused, people who are emotionally extremely fragile. They often lack guidance that extends to things like parental care and love. At the same time, they're often in great need of emotional stability and security. What happens with volunteers? They come in for a month, they give some tender loving care, that's all they want to do. And there's a very common and painful reality, right? Where schools, orphanages and shelters are often seen as glamorous and easy places to fit random volunteers in for a while. The needy beneficiaries, of course, lap out this affection as something they really desire in their lives. They cling on to the volunteers who come by as a bastion of stability in their lives. What is the problem? A month later, when these volunteers leave, there is no support mechanism to help children deal with the departure of this voluntary to their life. It's actually emotionally stabilizing. And to make things worse, it is not a one-off attempt. Mitra told you basically how you always concentrate volunteers projects in a few willing agencies or villages, right? So these children go through the same process of temporary care, development of attraction, and then painful departure all over again. Even if these volunteers claim that we will keep in touch and so on, right? This is highly untenable when your first commitment was really only to a 1 month long holiday to make you feel good. To make things worse, right, long-term caregivers are often not hired by such agencies and orphanages. Why? Most charitable institutions don't often come with a lot of spare cash, and now they will think we can save an expense because all these volunteers are constantly coming in to fill in a gap. That creates a deeply alienating procedure that is counterproductive to any initiative to provide company or love or care for any dependents to begin with. So really to sum up, right, we realize that there are people out there in need. If you want to help, then you do things like donate resources or commit for a long time if you really can. Volunteerism does no such good, and there are so many harms that outweigh any small benefit you can create. We think that humanitarians have an obligation to stay away from it, to show people that it is wrong. For all those reasons, I'm extremely proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Now I'd like to invite Deputy Leader of Opposition to start, continue opposition skills.
Sorry. If I were to rephrase Huiyi's speech, essentially this is what she said. She said that self-identified humanitarians, like her characterization, are generally a group of people who are very self-indulgent. When they go overseas, they will become poser humanitarians.
But the question is, how on earth is this self-indulgence related to a particular geographical location? Analysis never established. She talked about how, yes, tourism means probably there's an expectation of going home. This may mean 2 weeks or 1 month. But if you are going to lambast this point so much, essentially you only reach a point at which you say that short-term voluntarism is a bad idea to begin with. To respond to this point, then we'll say that then your portfolio should be a mixture of short-term, long-term voluntarism. It can also mean that you do local versus overseas work. Just diversify your portfolio out there. Because all the points that you talk about, like for example, these people will feel sad because you leave. Yes, of course they will feel sad when you leave. Even if you were to visit a local orphanage, they will feel sad when you leave out there, right? And even if you were to argue that you will say that, okay, fine, these locals, at least you can go and visit them more often. We argue that different batches of people handing over the baton is also an important part of voluntarism that we talk about over here. That's why your whole idea about how we were to build a center within a place, for example, in Cambodia, where we help them, is a good idea because these centers are often a place of renewal. We bring in new volunteers and then they get well trained. It is true that Cambodia may be a bit saturated, but my argument is this, is that often they use this as a springboard for other missions in more dangerous or more unfamiliar places, for example, in Myanmar out there. So at the end of today's debate, a lot of what she said are things that are bad about human nature, are things that are bad about short term. Yes, we agree with them, but just because that happens doesn't mean they therefore have a moral obligation not to be involved in voluntarism. Let's dig a little bit deeper. They say the systemic problems of voluntarism out there. They talk about issues of saturation. Look, there are many factors that drive against saturation out there, right? Just because after a while, why is it that when you go overseas, you have this magical intention that I want to be redundant, I want to be unnecessary out there, right? In fact, when you are going to go overseas, like travel 1,000 miles, often you want to make the best out of the 2 or 4 weeks out there. That is why when medical missions teams go overseas, they try and see thousands of patients within a particular day because they want to make the best of whatever outcome that they have. But secondly, right, for corporate social responsibility point, most companies, if they are going to be there for the next 10 to 15 years, they will start to realize that, look, I simply cannot just keep going to the same place because it becomes more and more redundant, or the needs of the people are gradually being fulfilled out there. I want to diversify my portfolio. These are the sort of self-incentives that will stop the point on saturation. And by the way, if they are going to stay there for the long term, like for the next 10 to 15 years, there are also benefits of them staying there for the long term because like what Huiyi talked about, there are certain limitations of short-term beneficial out there. So ladies and gentlemen, at this point in time, what is left in this debate? What is left in this debate is that voluntarism can be conducted in very different manners. Some people will want to go all the way. Like for example, when they go overseas and then they decide that they want to live, breathe, and eat like these people, they can do so. But like what Kanna mentioned, it's not really necessary for them to do so because for the individual in question, or the beneficiaries. Yes, he may not be as bad as a person in Central Africa, but he is still someone with a particular need. And if you were to ask him what is important to you, what is important to him is that his needs are being met. Even if the intention of the guy may not be the best, maybe he will post a Facebook photo after he does that. But that doesn't really matter in this particular instance. Analysis not dealt with. Yes?
Volunteering and working in a country is significantly different from voluntourism, which by definition is short-term and intermittent.
Yeah, okay. But my argument is that for 2 to 4 weeks, if we are able to argue that you are still able to help people in a particular way, this is just one of your many options in your toolbox of options to help people out there. You can very well spend the rest of the time doing local work out there. The argument may mean that you may refrain from doing too much volunteerism as the singular part of your portfolio, but that stops at that. You don't have a moral obligation to stop or to reject volunteerism as a concept, as a whole. So now I move on to my main point of substantive today. I'm going to talk about how, of all people, you want self-identified humanitarians to use volunteerism as part, or to adopt it as part of their portfolio so that they can change the very landscape of volunteerism. Ladies and gentlemen, it is true that volunteerism may be not the most well-planned, because every time, this is a true case of when you go overseas, you may not understand the needs of the people. That is the acknowledgement. But what is important to understand is this, is that often the reason why we still need to go overseas is because the locals there themselves can't help themselves, right? That is why there's a need for foreign people to go. When they go overseas, yes, they may be a bit insensitive. Yes, they take time to adapt, but there is still a unique extra value add to these particular situations. So in this particular situation, like they said, voluntourism is probably still going to exist under their paradigm. This means that someone else will take on the role. Like for example, instead of a self-identified humanitarian, it may be just someone who does voluntourism in an ad hoc basis. This may be the fresh graduate doing things for the first time. So why is this bad? Because for you to understand issues of like saturation, for you to understand things of language incompatibility or the fact of emotional separation, often you need to do this enough number of times. You need to have a local stay there, like maybe not stay there for a year, but multiple trips going over to the same place to understand this kind of situation. This is very different for ad hoc people. All the harms that you talk about for these ad hoc people that you talk about will plague ad hoc people even more, because at the end of the day, it is true that these people are more likely to be the people who have to do the poser to pose beside these photos. And finally, we need to argue this, that even if we were to take everything as equal, that your point that you mentioned, the rich retiree blonde, if the only thing that she's good at is painting houses, hugging children, making them feel good, and that is something that she is good at, and she identifies herself as a humanitarian, then we want her to carry on this particular lifestyle. Maybe she can make a specialization out of that. This is different, and this is better as compared to ad hoc people who don't know what to do, and then they decide to go overseas. They also need mentors like her to orientate this kind of situation. We want a mixture of the experienced versus the inexperienced people. But if all of them were to reject voluntourism, then we do not have these mentors.
Thanks. I know I'm short. I didn't think I was that short.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. To conclude the substantive speeches and government side, now I sit back up and wait. You're here.
It was strange that at the start of this debate, Kanna accepted the definition of voluntourism that Aditya wanted to give you, and then later in Marvin's speech, oh no, voluntourism and volunteerism are somehow extremely similar, and they are the same thing, and they do a lot of good. The case from side opposition is this: there is good that comes out of voluntourism. No shit, we agree. We think that there is good from voluntourism, but the burden on Gov was to prove more good than harm, and we don't think they have done that considering the list of harms that we have given to you on this side. We tell you at the end of the day that this motion is not a ban. People who want to do it because they're self-indulgent and they want to feel good about themselves can still do it. The point of this debate is, as a self-identified humanitarian, whether voluntourism is contradictory to their aims, is contradictory to their cause. And we say it is, because for self-identified humanitarians, voluntourism takes away capital for their end goal, takes away time and effort for their end aims. Rejection of these individuals provides awareness of why this is so, and allows for these self-identified humanitarians to get some benefit out of individuals who learn the terrible harms that come out of voluntourism through their rejection. We tell you very clearly that volunteerism is not the same as voluntourism. That is why your long-term work projects, where you go and be a doctor somewhere for a year or two, or as the Red Cross when you go to Japan after the tsunami, are things that are done under volunteerism, but not voluntourism. Voluntourism is short-term, where you go to learn about poor African kids because you can. The end goal is tourism first, where you devote resources specifically to the amusement of tourists and taking the right pictures over the needs of the poor that you're going to serve. That's why it's tourist as a tourist industry. We think that that's why it's far worse than what you can do under volunteerism. Let's look at a couple of important things. we need to first look at who these volunteers are, because we think that these volunteerists, as defined in the motion and in the word, is exactly contradictory to the definitions Marvin wanted to give you. These are, as Kanna said, your gap year college students, your people who really have nothing much to do except have time to go around and see the world. Your people who are extremely busy but who only have 2 weeks leave in their time but want to do personal good, which sounds very masturbatory. We think these are not individuals who are your technocrats or your skilled trainers or your structural planners who can actually do any good. The argument that came from them is, what about incentivizing altruism? You can do some amount of good and you can paint walls. Why would Marvin, after going through 6 years of medical school and becoming a doctor, pay thousands of dollars to go to Ethiopia and paint a wall? How is that beneficial to anyone? We don't think that that actually helps individuals. There are two groups of people who we look at when we incentivize altruism. The first are people who are interested to help, who actually want to do good. Under our paradigm, a rejection of voluntourism opens their eyes to how they can do greater good by giving money appropriately to the right sources, to the right charities, to get the right amount of humanitarian good done. Because a large part of voluntourism today for these individuals who want to do good is an ignorance of the harms that come out of what they are doing. We think that humanitarians rejecting voluntourism helps this group. But secondly, are the groups of people that they want to talk about. The rich blonde gap year student who only wants self-gain but thinks that they can do some good by putting bricks together for a wall. We are happy to say screw them. We really don't need them, because individuals on the ground within Ethiopia can build a well too. We don't need these individuals to do any sort of good. Let's look at what happens to harms versus benefits. The argument they wanted to make is, well, especially in Marvin's speech, right, it was, well, if they go to Cambodia, they may want to go to Myanmar too. Not really helping when there are a lot of harms that come to Cambodia from what you're doing, and then you go into Myanmar and do it all over again, causing the exact same harms. We don't think that's a good thing. But secondly, we think that with the limited time and money that most of these volunteers have to allocate, it's unlikely that they're going to go into multiple locations to learn from multiple things all at the same time. Because as you accepted in Leader of Opposition, these are your college students, your gap year students who really don't have much to do, who don't have the time or money to accept it. In contrast, the amount of harms that come out of the most popular kinds of voluntourism, and we're not saying that there are some volunteerists who have good intentions and are going to do a lot of good, but the most popular kinds of voluntourism tend to be more harmful. Before that, go.
There are some people that will indefinitely want to maximize their investment into charity, and there are some people who are disgusting and naive as you pay them out to. Why would these group of people have any incentive to commit a different type of charitable act if they are as disgusting as you paint them out to?
Yeah, that's my point. If they're as disgusting and naive as we paint them out to be, the rejection, one, doesn't do anything to them, but two, we really don't care for them either. We don't think that these are important people, and we don't want their charity, and we don't want their money, and we don't want their time, because the likelihood is that their money and their time is going to go into harms to the people in Ethiopia, and we really don't care. Harms of voluntourism that we gave you, that we heard absolutely no response to on that side. One, we told you economic wastage was an issue because large amounts of money spent on going there instead is spent in the coffers of exploitative travel agencies. No response. Secondly, we told you it strips jobs from locals because locals can be hired to paint walls and put bricks together and carry bags of cement. The locals can have these jobs that your college gap year students are taking from these individuals because they don't have the skills to do anything better in these Ethiopian villages for these people. But thirdly, we told you there's absolutely no continuity with these projects. One, there's no R&D for what they really need, which means your most rural, faraway places are the least likely to get any help under voluntourism. But the capital for this volunteering help is going into one isolated, most accessible, most convenient city and takes away capital to help from any other location and in the same country. It's unsustainable because it doesn't help individuals on the ground. It in fact gives them a glimpse of hope, a glimpse of happiness, and then strips it away from them because people leave at the end of 2 to 4 weeks. We think that emotional trauma is unfair. We think the harms to the villagers are unfair. We don't think that voluntourism is something that humanitarians should accept.
Thank you, Government Whip. To conclude the substantive speeches of this debate, now acted by opposition.
It's kind of difficult for me to reconcile that the nuance that's come throughout the bench tells you that if you're not doing enough good, we don't want you. Because that's explicitly what Viha said in the reply to the POI. If we're not happy with the depth of the pockets in terms of how your hands have reached, if we're not doing as much good as we think you have, then you don't fall under a specific mold of what humanitarianism should be like. What we have failed to understand, since when has the works of a humanitarian been molded into a specific bracket in which you need to conform into? That's the debate, and they've not proven it from the offset. What you heard from Aditya is a shopping list of harms that can be mitigated if the right actions are taken, but never once proving that the works of a humanitarian is a bucket that you need to dive into and fit into a specific mold. So the stance coming from government is not it's not that there's no harm to this. You're not just doing enough good. And by the way, let's clarify one thing. The kind of extreme examples where they send you overseas to paint a wall, voluntourism is much more than that. They make you do things like social services that would not have been done otherwise. If they were really stealing jobs from people that were downtrodden and who really need this, I'm really sure there would have been a mass groundswell of opposition towards these kinds of movements. It's pretty simplistic, guys. Very, very well done. 3 things I'm going to talk to you about. Firstly is the definition of humanitarianism, and why we think it's particularly important to understand that the benchmarks of humanitarianism never came with an obligation where you are defined by the amount of maximization of resources that you put into your humanitarian work. Secondly, why we think it's patronizing to wear a badge of honor as a systemic approval that you are far better than the next humanitarian, and why those definitive lines should not exist. But lastly, what are the standards of charity? Or rather, do we really need standards of charity to begin with? So firstly, the definitions of a humanitarian. Not yet, sit down. Firstly, we think that the benchmarks of a humanitarian never came with an obligation that your worth of a humanitarian is judged by the degree of work that you do, so long and so forth as there's a mass out or there's a significant output of positivity. You could have done more. Yes, we agree. Everyone could have done more, even the richest of the richest. But what we haven't heard is why this significantly needs to be a proportionate measurement of you as an individual with the amount of largesse you have, with the amount of largesse that you have, through the works that you do for charity. What we think this does is a self-righteous qualitative assessment and discrimination from person to person that we don't think is fair to these people. Why? Because the involvement of humanitarian work never came with a prerequisite that you need to do all that you can do. Those prerequisites were never an objective standard for people who wanted to get involved in these types of humanitarian work. That the degree of charity in these instances have to be at the behest of what that person deems fit. So if he wants to move across the way around the world to paint a wall, if that to him provides a mass amount of benefit as far as he can see, who are you to tell him that those benchmarks are distorted and you need to do more because you can do more? That's the problem that you have with this debate. Not yet. But more importantly, we think the extrapolation of this harm is that it doesn't appeal to the vast majority of people where you're judged, the degree of humanitarianism is judged by the depth of your pocket. And because that assessment, that judgment call is something that they want to make a blanket policy for everyone, because otherwise you're not a humanitarian because you could have done more. That's the kind of moral judgment call that we're not willing to stand by. Go.
People who are weighted intelligent will go under both paradigms. Our policies will affect ignorant people who can be convinced to do better and not harm people and optimize the good that they can do.
Precisely. If you want to convince people that they can do better, by all means convince them. But when you tell them you have a moral obligation to fit into a template, otherwise you would not be considered as a humanitarian, that's the problem that we have. You conflate the idea of awareness and you conflate the idea of convincing people to do more with the idea that you demonize these people who perform volunteerism as a good act of charity. And that's why we will win this debate. Secondly is the idea of patronage. And we told you, what they want is for people to qualitatively compare themselves to the next humanitarian and wear it as a badge of honor. We think this is pernicious and patronizing for a number of reasons. To call yourself a true humanitarian under their model, you need to maximize the amount of resources we do. We don't agree there's wastage. It's not a perfect system that can always be improved. But to tell people that your only method of empathization with people and the only ability for you to sympathize with people is if you understand the status by being like them, that's when we have the comparative analysis, and that's when we have that problem. It is not a qualitative assessment of the degree of value you are as a human being just because you haven't done as much as the next person. Why is there a specific moral code that you need to abide by, especially when you do works of charity? Because otherwise the degree of that moral code becomes diluted if you don't do as much as we think you can. So no, it's not about a cluster of wearing a badge of honor or a comparative of humanitarians from the next person. We think that's pernicious. But lastly, and this is the clincher where we win this debate, the standards of charity. They told us that because there's a lot of money that's being wasted or misappropriated, the standards of charity should be this. You need to maximize the utmost amount of resources for as long as possible. And they drew links to like how projects are not finished, jobs are being stolen. Look, if there are problems with the dynamics in terms of how this is done, fix those problems, right? So if projects are not finished, lengthen the periods of how volunteerism works. If you think there's misappropriation of funds, reappropriate them to things that to places that deserve them most. These are all dynamics and certain variables that can be changed. They're not a blanket policy. But what you lose at the end of the day, when you specifically tell these people who want to perform these acts of charity, is that you have a moral obligation to turn a blind eye and turn away. That's when we think you forsake the people who need it the most, people in these types of things. Because understand this, the converse is not better charity. It's the absence of charity. And that's the problem with side government. Lastly, we told you that this is a self-righteous high barrier to entry. Why? Because it doesn't mean, because the performance of these forms of charity does not mean that people get harmed through this. It just means that there's no maximization of resources. Why we're fine with that on opposition is because there is some degree of good that is formed as an output that otherwise would not have existed. For you to demonize volunteerism, you need to prove that the converse is far better, where these people have that form of incentive to turn away and perform much more than they're doing now, because otherwise we would rather stick to the little that we have under the context that the Prime Minister said. So any form of barrier to entry right now, you make it far harder for people who want to commit these types of things. We're very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. The debate now moves into reply stages, and I'd like to invite Opposition reply.
At the end of listening to side proposition, I think what they are really trying to achieve is to come up with a list of what is an ideal volunteer. First, you need to be a technocrat. Secondly, if you help, you should go all the way. Don't take 2 weeks of leave. Take 2 years of leave. Don't just talk to orphans. Adopt them and bring back home, right? Guys, this is not the debate, right? But the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's not just a problem of drawing a list. It's a problem at which when Viha said that if you cannot fulfill this particular list, don't even bother trying. Who the hell are you to, on behalf of the people or the African children, who the hell are you to say that don't go and lend the help to this group of people over there, right? Because if this group of people, the beneficiaries don't even care, why on earth are you like stopping people from helping other people? Next argument, right, is this. Can a self-identified humanitarian still be a good role model if he engages on volunteerism? And our answer is a resounding Yes, because at the end of the day, you never really said that there were harms of voluntarism. At the very most, you proved that the good was not that much. So in this particular instance, if this group of self-identified humanitarians are still doing some form of good, they can very well be role models in their own rights. But what is most important is that for these people to be role models, they need to be present, i.e. for the ad hoc volunteers who still go on this voluntarism, if all your self-identified humanitarians don't go on the same trip, then how are they going to be role models out there? But finally, it's also an issue of value judgment, right? Because there exists in our society groups of people who do not have a political science degree, who do not have a medical degree, and the most that they can do perhaps is symbolic, perhaps it's just feeding a child, perhaps it's just painting a house, or just being physically present there. For this group of people, we need to really tell them what is good. If you can't fulfill this particular list, do you still, and you still want to call yourself a humanitarian, do you still have the moral obligation to reject? And our answer to them is, no, you don't have to. Just continue with whatever you are doing out there. But the final thing, and I think this is really the crux of what they are arguing, and it's quite commendable on the side, is this. They say that voluntarism has some systemic limitations. And because it is so problematic, then as an advocate, like a self-identified humanitarian, you have a responsibility to boycott this particular system. And this is when we engage them at their very best. Most of the problems, ladies and gentlemen, are not problems with voluntarism. It's a problem of human beings out there. When they talk about this businessman who is so busy that he can only take 2 weeks leave, in this particular instance, your discomfort is the fact that this businessman called himself a self-identified humanitarian rather than the fact that voluntarism is bad. And secondly, a lot of their arguments is this, is that voluntarism means that when you go overseas, you suddenly become more self-indulgent. When you go overseas, the only thing that you want to do is to be unnecessary and redundant. All these arguments, like, never once responded to throughout all their speakers out there, which goes to show this. Even if voluntarism were to be something that needs to be improved, because under their policy, they are not going to have a moratorium on voluntarism. I argue in my speech that the best group of people, best positioned to change the landscape, improve the landscape, are the self-identified humanitarians, because they are not the 2 weeks businessmen. They are probably people who took the gap year or probably go on a regular basis, multiple visits, and they are the ones who are most, really the most close to the ground and able to identify problems of saturation, able to identify the structural problems, and they need to be there for the particular purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, we can have many opinions on voluntarism. It can be long-term, it can be short-term, but it is important for us not to be fixated or fetishized over a particular list of what you can or you cannot do. Amongst these self-identified humanitarians, some of them can be very, very altruistic. They can even be priests, right? Take a vow and then we'll get rid of the worldly affairs. Go and do that. But there are also people who say that I want to be to have a balance of profit motive. I still want to have my holiday. And for this group of people, we say, go ahead. If you want to do something good, we are not going to stop you, because on behalf of African children, these people really do need help.
Thank you, Opposition Reply, to finish up this debate. Now I'd like to invite
It must be ironic for the opposition to come out and stand before a slide with the motion on it and then miss a point completely each time. Let's start by making things extremely simple. This is a narrative in which your debate operates. Say, I decide that I want to volunteer. But instead of thinking about how my skills fits the needs of people elsewhere, or how to get the most benefit for the people I want to be beneficiaries, I go online and look at packages offering me tours to Africa. Because you know why? I like black kids. I think they're really cute. And I don't want to organize stuff by myself. And it's really not fun to get to go overseas and experience the African climate. Do you know how selfish you sound when you say that? And that is really the problem with them. The problem with voluntarism is that volunteering is not about you and never ever should be about you. And basically, right, the problem is that it's not just that you make it about you, right? is that you make it about you and then pretend it's about children in need. Pretend about somebody else. They refuse to recognize the trade-off that we proved at the very start when Aditya came out with this entire list of the multiple harms that accrue from voluntourism. Even worse, if you want to be a humanitarian, not just any volunteer off the street, self-professed humanitarian, dedicated to doing good, and then you come out and tell me this is the best way to go about volunteering, that is the true harm. I'm going to deal with 3 clashes. Firstly, what is volunteerism? It is not as though you follow the Red Cross during a time of crisis because you're a trained doctor or nurse. It is not long-term work and coordination with local overseas aid agencies. It is basically when you try to combine tourism and volunteering, and when you put tourism as a dominant priority over volunteering. So you try to get the best of your own world. You define that you want to spend limited amounts of time, you want to have some fun while you're at it. The issue, right, is that given the abject poverty of the people in need, we don't need somebody else in the form of you to put your own desires over the suffering. I think that altruism is the primary need in any voluntary initiative. Unless you are willing to give of yourself and not demand things in return, it is just not enough, and we do not want you there. Let's bring this further. It is not just unnecessary, it is bad. The debate really comes down to how the conflation of tourism and volunteering is detrimental. It comes at the expense of the altruism that we so dearly need. And you really need altruism for people to be willing to do the tough stuff, the dirty work, the unpleasant things to help those who are truly suffering. But what are you doing? You take jobs from the poor. The blonde woman is not only painting walls, she is painting walls that people could have gotten pay from doing themselves. You're diverting limited resources away from truly efficient ways of helping people. You're stopping any initiative at creating structural aid. You're creating emotional issues of dependence that you interact with for your own pleasure. All these harms were never denied. They were carelessly dismissed by the opposition as being a mere shopping list. But guess what? You haven't rebutted it. The shopping list is checking out. So basically, right, we see also from them in Tim's speech a concession that your system is flawed. Because Tim analyzes your system in terms of its potential for fixing and not its present-day application. And that's precisely why we tell you, right, that voluntourism is a bad form of volunteerism. Because you're ignoring and hurting people in need. I don't care what your sensitive feelings or wanting to help people. It is, again, it's really not about you. There are people with far greater needs. So why, right, and this is the third idea, why should humanitarians not do it? And it's the fundamental flaw. They have conflated volunteers with humanitarians. Very different concepts. Self-identified humanitarians want to make their cause known to the world. There's an expectation that they will demonstrate what is the right way to truly get maximal benefit to other people. But what you're doing now is to allow humanitarians to feed wrong impressions to people curious about how to make a difference, and also to people who are already ignorant from the start. We're not saying that humanitarians must have full 100% success in influencing even the naive and the ignorant. But at the very least, you must transmit the right message to get to everybody you can. So really, I stress it all over again. Volunteering is never about you. Even more so if your duty is that of a humanitarian. And what they're really doing, therefore, is to not get people to pay for a necessary, important, or influential trip, but really just an ego trip.
Yeah.